You were saying?
The judge's house. Okay.
सर अभी आप क्या शुरू से कराएंगे?
Wait. Uh, Mr. Wymish, who you came right now. Okay, now please listen, Mr. Wymish. We started the story from the literature, and the story name is The Judge's House. The Judge's House. It is from the literature, the storybook, and the main character we have showed. There were only three main characters that I have shared the screen with the students, and these were three main characters. Where the story has gone. Somebody has shared this. Please, participants, you do not share. Let me share this. Okay, the main three characters of this, the judge's house story were Mr. Malcolmson, Mrs. Witham. Mr. Malcolmson was basically a scholar and a mathematician who was these days preparing himself for an exams, a math exams. Mrs. Witham was the landlady. She was a landlady somewhere in a hotel, and Mrs. Demister is a charwoman, or you can call a servant of Mr. Judge's house, servant of Mr. Mr. Judge, Mr. Judge's house. She was the female servant over there. And what happens? Okay. Mr. Wymish, we're just starting the story, but on a very fast track again. Please listen.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so what happens? Mr. Malcolmson wanted an isolated place, a very calm place for his exams preparation, and in search of that place, he does not even ask his friends favor that whether his friends know about a place which is very isolated and which is very calm. Why? Because he thinks that if he takes help from his friends, what his friends will do, that I mean, definitely they will come to know that where Mr. Malcolmson is staying these days. So they might visit him and disturb him. So he does not take any help from his friends, and he goes to the station. And at that station, he sees into the route of the places, and randomly he selects one place where he thinks that he has never visited before, and that place name was Benchurch. Benchurch, Ben Church, Church, Benchurch. So he gets off to the Benchurch, and there he rents a house and rents a room in a hotel, and that landlady of that hotel was Mrs. Vedam, which I have earlier mentioned, Mrs. Vedam, Witham. Okay, so he likes the room very much, but he was not still very happy because he wanted more isolated, and he wanted even better, even more calm place. So what he decides that he will stay in this hotel for one day, and the next day he will go in search of a better and a more isolated place. So one day he stays there, the next day he goes in the search of a better or a more isolated place. He finds one house which will look very old, and with the walls, high walls made of the bricks, and very old kind of house. And that was about 100 years old house. That was the judge's house, and he likes that house, and he thinks that this seems to be very isolated place, and he should rent that place, and he should prepare for his exams in this place, and there would be nobody to disturb. So he goes and meets to a person was a lawyer, and he had the keys and all the charge of that judge's house. He rents that house for 3 months, and he pays 3 months rent in advance, and he comes back to the hotel, and then he, with a surprise, he tells this to Mrs. Vidam, that he has found the place which is more isolated, and he tells her that this place is the judge's house. When he tells her that he has rented the judge's house, Mrs. Vidam, with a surprise and with a fear, says, "No, oh no, not the judge's house, not the judge's house." With to see her surprise, Mr. Malcolmson asks that why are you so surprised and with bursting with the fear that uh, I shouldn't have rented I shouldn't have rented the judge's house. She says that it is believed by the locals. Locals means the people around that judge's house. She says it is believed that this is haunted house and there's something wrong in that house. And what is something wrong? She doesn't exactly know because nobody has informed her that what is wrong. But there's something wrong in that house. Whoever rents that house does not stay more than a month or more than a week and leaves that house. And further, she tells him that this she tells him that this house uh, was owned by the judge 100 years ago, and the judge was famous for hanging the people. I mean, in the prisoner house. I mean, he was very cruel judge, and that judge used to hang people when after sentencing them to death, and he used to hang them in that house. So that was very cruel judge 100 years ago. And what happened with that judge, nobody knows. So she says that you shouldn't have rented that house, but since you have already rented, what I can't say that. She says that if somebody gives me the money as much as the river water is, but still she will not spend even 1 hour in that house. But she says, and further she says that if it was her son and wanted to stay in that house, she would never allow him to stay in that house. Mr. Malcolmson was not a person to be afraid so quickly. He does not pay any attention to her story. And in the end, when she was telling the story about the haunted house, the judge's house, she excuses. She says, "I'm sorry that if you have been disturbed or a bit afraid of after hearing the story I've told." Mr. Malcolmson said that I am not afraid and I'm not the person who can be very quickly afraid. And he says that I would go and stay there because I wanted to prepare. I want to prepare my exams and I want an isolated place, and that is the best place into me. Okay, then he does not care. Mr. Malcolmson does not care about what Mrs. Vedam said, and he goes to stay in that house. In that house, he was already given one maid servant. A charwoman. Her name was Demister, Mrs. Demister. Her work was to prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and to clean the judge's house for him. And after doing this all, she has to go back her home. So what happens? Mr. Malcolmson was very happy. Mr. Malcolmson started preparing his exams, and once he was reading a book and sitting on a chair, and he wanted to have a cup of tea, and he was feeling a bit cold. He wanted to put on the fire. He stands up and puts on the fire, and he was making tea for him. He hears some strange noise of the rat. And in search of the noise, he goes and he finds in one room there were so many lines and cracks and holes on the wall, and there were so many rats hiding themselves in the holes and the cracks. He was not afraid to see this, and he thinks that in such old house, this is very common, the rats and all that. He closed the door, he comes back and sits on the chair again with his tea, and then he suddenly sees that even the louder noise of the rats, and he sees one rat standing in front of him. He wanted to make that rat run away, and he pretends that there's something in his hand and he throws against the rat. I mean, normally when we want to make the crow run away or any such birds or animal. So what we do is that we pretend that there's something in our hand and we pretend to throw against that animal or the bird so that the animal or the bird may run away. So he does the same, but instead, the rat should run away. The rat starts showing his fearful or dangerous teeth to Mr. Malcolmson, and it was a gesture that the rat says that he was not afraid at all. And Mr. Malcolmson was a bit surprised that how come the rat is not running, and he stands up and runs after the rat. And when he runs after the rat, the rat to see him runs away, and he gets into the room where Mr. Malcolmson was surprised to see that there was a big clock and it was hanging by a rope, and he sees that the rat he saw was of an enormous size, a very big size normally, and he has the appearance as if that was not a rat, that was a kind of human being. I mean, such a huge size and act and run. I mean, like just a human being. So he was very much afraid, but he did not show his fear to the rat, and he further just made the rat run away. Then, leaving some surprise for you that what happens? What was that rat? How, why it looked like the human? Whether was he Mr. Judge himself who turned to be a rat because of his cruelty, or what exactly happened? What was that rat, and what happened with Mr. Malcolmson? Did he stay longer, or he also run away? Did he fight with the rats? How did he conclude? All that story I cannot tell. I will leave some suspense. I have told you some of the story. Now I will turn on the audio recording in which the whole story is read and explained. So you will enjoy. I hope. Let me turn on it. Let me turn on the story.
Till when the class will continue?
Uh, I will just complete it soon. Don't worry.
Sir, when will the class finish?
Sir, what is that?
It will be finished soon, so don't worry. I will just play this and try to just play it on a fast track. You have to listen this a little bit, and then what I would do is that after maybe 10 minutes I will stop it and I will share with you on a Google Classroom this recording so that you can listen over there. So don't worry, and I will also share this class of mine there. But right now, please listen this a bit. Let me share this with you. Okay, listen.
Please everyone unmute yourself.
Sorry,
Unmute everyone now.
sorry.
Sir, you unmute everyone now.
I have already mute, but I don't know how come they've just come again. I have mute them all.
There will be a way in which they cannot again unmute without your permission.
I've just I have done this, but disable participants. Shall I play? Okay, let me.
When the time for his examination drew near, Malcolm Malcolmson made up his mind to go somewhere to read by himself. He feared the attractions of the seaside, and also he feared completely rural isolation, for of old he knew its charms, and so he determined to find some unpretentious little town where there would be nothing to distract him. He refrained from asking suggestions from any of his friends, for he argued that each would recommend some place of which he had knowledge and where he had already acquaintances. As Malcolmson wished to
Boys, listen to me. There's some student, I don't know, who just starts putting lines on whatever I share. They just use the tool to just highlight or put some lines. Please do not do this. It is very easy to identify. And if once I identify, there will be actions taken against you. Please do not do this, right?
Mind to go somewhere to read by himself. He feared the attractions of the seaside, and also he feared completely rural isolation, for of old he knew its charms, and so he determined to find some unpretentious little town where there would be nothing to distract him. He refrained from asking suggestions from any of his friends, for he argued that each would recommend some place of which he had knowledge and where he had already acquaintances. As Malcolmson wished to avoid friends, he had no wish to encumber himself with the attention of friends' friends, and so he determined to look out for a place for himself. He packed a portmanteau with some clothes and all the books he required, and then took ticket for the first name on the local timetable which he did not know. When, at the end of 3 hours' journey, he alighted at Benchurch, he felt satisfied that he had so far obliterated his tracks as to be sure of having a peaceful opportunity of pursuing his studies. He went straight to the one inn which the sleepy little place contained, and put up for the night. Benchurch was a market town, and once in 3 weeks was crowded to excess. But for the remainder of the 21 days, it was as attractive as a desert. Malcolmson looked around the day after his arrival to try to find quarters more isolated than even so quiet an inn as the Good Traveller afforded. There was only one place which took his fancy, and it certainly satisfied his wildest ideas regarding quiet. In fact, quiet was not the proper word to apply to it. Desolation was the only term conveying any suitable idea of its isolation. It was an old, rambling, heavy-built house of the Jacobean style, with heavy gables and windows, unusually small and set higher than was customary in such houses, and was surrounded with a high brick wall massively built. Indeed, on examination, it looked more like a fortified house than an ordinary dwelling. But all these things pleased Malcolmson. Here, he thought, is the very spot I have been looking for, and if I can get opportunity of using it, I shall be happy. His joy was increased when he realized beyond doubt that it was not at present inhabited. From the post office he got the name of the agent, who was rarely surprised at the application to rent a part of the old house. Mr. Carnford, the local lawyer and agent, was a genial old gentleman, and frankly confessed his delight at anyone being willing to live in the house. "To tell you the truth," he said, "I should be only too happy on behalf of the owners to let anyone have the house rent-free for a term of years, if only to accustom the people here to see it inhabited. It has been so long empty that some kind of absurd prejudice has grown up about it, and this can be best put down by its occupation, if only," he added with a sly glance at Malcolmson, "by a scholar like yourself, who wants its quiet for a time." Malcolmson thought it needless to ask the agent about the absurd prejudice.
Are you all guys listening the story?
Yes.
Were you listening? Were you able to listen the story?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Shall
sir,
I-
we are listening.
Shall I continue for some more time?
Yes.
Okay, when you were listening the story, on the screen there was only story or the faces of all the participants, including me?
No, sir, only story.
Only story. Okay, I'm just turning on the story, sharing the story again. Listen the story, and what we will do is, we can't listen the whole story because it is of around 40 minutes. Then what I would do is that after you listen a little bit the story, then what I would do is I would share the story on a Google Classroom with you all. All right? Is that okay?
Okay, sir. Yes,
Alright,
sir.
alright.
Yes, sir.
Sir, this is 4 hour story.
Sorry?
This story consists of 4 hours.
No, not of for 40
14
minutes.
minutes. 14 minutes, okay.
14 not 40, 40.
40. Yeah, acha, 40, okay, okay.
Sir, if you want to send this story on Google
I will send,
Classroom, you can do like this. You can tell,
but listen,
summarize the story.
but listen a bit of the story, then I will be sharing it on Google Classroom. But listen a bit.
Hello.
Yes.
He knew he would get more information if he should require it on that subject from other quarters. He paid his 3 months' rent, got a receipt, and the name of an old woman who would probably undertake to do for him, and came away with the keys in his pocket. He then went to the landlady of the inn, who was a cheerful and most kindly person, and asked her advice as to such stores and provisions as he would be likely to require. She threw up her hands in amazement when he told her where he was going to settle himself. "Not in the judge's house," she said, and grew pale as she spoke. He explained the locality of the house, saying that he did not know its name. When he had finished, she answered, "Aye, sure enough, the very place. It is the judge's house, sure enough." He asked her to tell him about the place, why so called, and what there was against it. She told him that it was so called locally because it had been many years before, how long she could not say, as she herself was from another part of the country, but she thought it must have been 100 years or more, the abode of a judge who was held in great terror on account of his harsh sentences and his hostility to prisoners at assizes. As to what there was against the house itself, she could not tell. She had often asked, but no one could inform her. But there was a general feeling that there was something. And for her own part, she would not take all the money in Drinkwater's bank and stay in the house an hour by herself. Then she apologized to Malcolmson for her disturbing talk. "It is too bad of me, sir, and you, and a young gentleman too, if you will pardon me saying it, going to live there all alone. If you were my boy, and you'll excuse me for saying it, you wouldn't sleep there a night, not if I had to go there myself and pull the big alarm bell that's on the roof." The good creature was so manifestly in earnest, and was so kindly in her intentions, that Malcolmson, although amused, was touched. He told her kindly how much he appreciated her interest in him, and added, "But my dear Mrs. Witham, indeed you need not be concerned about me. A man who is reading for the mathematical tripos has too much to think of to be disturbed by any of these mysterious somethings, and his work is of too exact and prosaic a kind to allow of his having any corner in his mind for mysteries of any kind. Harmonical progression, permutations and combinations, and elliptical functions have sufficient mysteries for me." Mrs. Witham kindly undertook to see after his commissions, and he went himself to look for the old woman who had been recommended to him. When he returned to the judge's house with her, after an interval of a couple of hours, he found Mrs. Witham herself waiting with several men and boys carrying parcels, and an upholsterer's man with a bed in a car, for, she said, though tables and chairs might be all very well, a bed that hadn't been aired for mayhap 50 years was not proper for young bones to lie on. She was evidently curious to see the inside of the house, and though manifestly so afraid of the somethings that at the slightest sound she clutched on to Malcolmson, whom she never left for a moment, went over the whole place.
All right, boys. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to share this on Google Classroom, because we cannot just go along with the whole story, this thing, because it would be too long. I have told you the summary of the story, except the ending. I'm going to share this with you, the audio, the text along with the audio explanation with you all. You can just listen whenever you're free. And then once you are done with this, I will share the questions, and you have to answer those questions and send back to me, right? Is that okay with you all?
Sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and
Yes,
and
sir.
all those who did not attend, who could not attend today's class, I have recorded this, and I will also be sharing this with them on the Google Classroom. So you can just those who did not listen from the start my class, so they can see, they can watch, and they can listen the class from the very start, and then they can listen to that audio that I'm going to share now, and then they will be able to answer the question that I will be sharing, right?
Okay, sir.
Okay, bye-bye from my side, Hafiz.
Okay.
Okay.